So one of the most historically disingenuous things you hear thrown around by the right wing is about how many people communism has killed throughout history. Oh, communism has killed 100 million people. It's killed 200 million people. It's killed untold millions. And you know, our wonderful system of capitalism has never killed anyone. It's just communism that has killed everyone. So it's obviously very disingenuous. And I think to sum up the point of how ridiculous it is in terms of ascertaining these numbers, I want to read about a story that has come out recently. So the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation adds global coronavirus deaths to its tallies of historical victims of communism. So by this logic already, you're thinking that their tally of historical victims of communism must be pretty ridiculous if they're throwing in the victims of a pandemic and a disease into the list. So the article goes on to say, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is officially recognizing global coronavirus deaths as the fault of the Chinese government and adding them to its tally of historical victims of communism, the organization announced Friday. The announcement comes as part of the VOC's report on the Chinese Communist Party's cover-up of the COVID-19 outbreak in Wuhan and its continued efforts to suppress the pandemic. The organisation also pointed to the WHO as working to carry water for the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. To date, more than 95,000 people have died of the coronavirus globally, and in a statement they said, while the pandemic's final death toll is still unknown, those who've perished from the outbreak must be included in the global count of the 100 million deaths at the hands of communism. So just to show you their bias, they're saying that the WHO, a UN organisation, is in bed with the Chinese government. Now there are obviously problems there. We've seen the stuff with Taiwan and China, but that's mainly to do with the UN as a whole rather than, you know, the lead of the WHO loving the Chinese government. So you guys probably heard that and think this is pretty ridiculous. How can you say that a natural, I guess, disaster in terms of a global pandemic caused by animals living in a cramped condition together, how can you say that is from communism? So let's get into what the organisation is a bit more. On their own page they write, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is an educational research and human rights non-profit devoted to commemorating more than 100 million victims of communism around the world and to pursuing the freedom of those still living under totalitarian regimes. The foundation was authorised by a unanimous congressional act which was signed by Bill Clinton on December 17th, 1993. From 2003 to 2009, President George Bush was the honorary chairman of the foundation. So we can see a lovely bit of bipartisanship to shit on communists. Not surprising, it is the United States. What I want to get into is how this ridiculous logic is always used to make a massive list of so-called communist deaths while at the same time refusing to either acknowledge how these communist parties or why these communist parties got in charge in the first place. Hint, it's normally a response to capitalists killing loads of them, or even trying to pin down how the ideology of communism results in these deaths and how, you know, the ideology of communism has inspired some of these things that have killed people. So I think the best example and what people often see is that what these so-called, you know, victims lists like to do, they like to inflate the numbers with millions and millions of people who've died in famines, which of course you can say can be managed by a government and can be made worse by a government, but can you really say a lot of these famines are caused by communism and caused by a communist ideology? I find that's a bit of a stretch, especially in countries like the USSR and China, who recently threw off their own governments and then they just have this country to manage. Famines happen throughout history, especially in vast countries like China and the USSR. It's kind of hard to manage that whole country and stop a famine from happening, especially in the 1930s and early 1950s in China's case. So obviously that is a disingenuous thing. Whether you can make an argument and criticise certain governments, the way they handle those things, of course that's fine. I don't understand what that's got to do with communism at the end of the day, how you handle a famine. And of course they also like to pluck numbers out of thin air or just be really disingenuous. So I think I saw on their website they said 1 million Vietnamese were killed by communism. 1 million Vietnamese people were killed by communism. And of course, you might be sitting there thinking that's a very strange number and it's a very strange situation to really say that there were victims of communism in the context of the Vietnam War. So obviously you guys will know that Vietnam was fighting a war of independence. Ho Chi Minh had been promised by the US's own OSS, which is a precursor to CIA, that if he fought the Japanese, they would help him get independence. Of course, it goes without saying, the Americans turned on the Vietnamese, leading to the First Indochina War, which led to the peace deal which made North and South Vietnam. Now, I'm pretty sure what this foundation also have done is put the people killed by the Viet Minh in this war into that list. They're the victims of communism. And then what they've also done is taken the war's tally as a whole, and I think they've put the casualties of the US forces, the South Vietnamese forces, the South Koreans and civilians onto that list. And again, how are these people so-called victims when it's a war for one thing, and a war where the amount of casualties falls far heavier on the communist side and civilian side? Do you think the North Vietnamese killed more civilians than the US, who indiscriminately bombed population centres in North Vietnam, especially in the early 1970s? You think the Vietnamese communists kill more of these people? But again, where is the balance? Where is the nuance? Where do you draw the line on what a victim of communism is? What does this person have to be, or is there no limit to what they can be? Can they literally be a Nazi who invaded the USSR and be killed by a Soviet soldier, and therefore they're a victim of communism? But again, it also goes to a lack of understanding what communism is. Communism, of course, has never existed. It's the end goal of socialism. It's a utopian, society that a lot of socialists hope will one day come to existence. It hasn't actually existed. But if we take that even further, I'm sure a lot of you guys who are either communist or you're socialists would agree that a lot of these so-called communist leaders during the Cold War weren't actually very communist. A lot of us would not argue that North Korea is a communist country. If you look at what they do, you look at who's in charge, how can you say that's communist? Where in the Communist Manifesto and various socialist works does it say, right, if you want a communist society, you've got to start it with one family and his son, and then his son will be the leaders. So it's basically like a dynasty and a monarchy, which communists hate. Then you basically isolate it from the whole world, enact insane laws, and create a huge cult of personality where you literally believe the leader of this country is a divine being. And somehow we're going to classify that as a communist country. Give me a break. But the victims of Communism Foundation will obviously classify the North Koreans as communists because they say they are. So just because they say they are, that means they must be communist, despite them not having a communist society, despite them not even having a socialist society, despite them creating an insane country with a massive cult around a guy they think is like a literal god. We're still going to say everyone they kill in these prison camps is a victim of communism. Again, how disingenuous is that? And I think you can extend that to a lot of so-called communist leaders, like Pol Pot is another one. How is communist ideology motivating that guy? It's not. It's just a symptom of the geopolitical realities of the time, where you had the Eastern Bloc versus the Western Bloc, you had the communists versus the capitalists. So again, it just shows you it's a bit of a joke. Even if you wanted to make a legit list of the victims of so-called communists, it's crazy what they will just throw in there. So COVID-19. But again, COVID-19 in a country like Britain has been made worse by capitalist priorities. So are we going to say that because Boris Johnson pursued herd immunity, because this government delayed the lockdown because they're worried about the economy, are we going to say the people who have died, the excess people who have died in this country, they're victims of capitalism? Are we going to say that? Because we could make that argument. It's quite clear that they placed the economy's health over human health. That's pretty capitalistic, and it's going to result in many more deaths in this country. Because obviously there are criticisms with how China handled it. I'm not going to debate that, but to say it's somehow a death toll caused by communism, which you can't even seem to define properly, is pretty ridiculous. And I doubt they'd like us to switch this round and say the victims of capitalism. How many people die every day from capitalism? And we could be really disingenuous with these arguments as well and say these guys are completely accurate, even though they're not. Let's say they're completely accurate. 100 million people have been killed by communists. If we were going to be as accurate as them, how many people do you think have been killed by capitalists? Are we going to put World War II in there? The Nazis were capitalists. The British were capitalists. The Americans were capitalists. We're going to stick that in there. We're going to stick World War I, a massive imperial war where the elite of several countries threw millions of young men to go kill each other over capital and over empire. Are we going to throw that in there? Because that together has already dwarfed the so-called 100 million. Are we going to put Vietnam in there? Are we going to put all the Vietnamese civilians and all the North Vietnamese the Americans killed for capitalism? Are we going to put that in there? Are we going to put the Iraq War in there? Are we going to put the Afghan War in there? Are we going to put the Gulf War in there? See what I mean? But I feel like the Victims of Communism Foundation might find some problems with what we're doing, even though it sounds pretty justifiable. But it just shows you it's just a political sideshow, really. It doesn't really focus on historical realities. It doesn't focus on anything in terms of cause and effect. Why did the North Vietnamese kill South Vietnamese? Why did the Cuban revolutionaries kill, the Baptista regime's soldiers? Why did they put them on trial after the revolution? Why did these people do all these things? Is it because communism made them rabid and evil? Or was communism and communist revolution a response to decades, if not centuries, of exploitation at the hands of capitalists? So the real victims here a lot of the time are the people who rise up, not the people who get what they deserve at the end of these revolutions. People like Baptista's cronies, people like Baptista's soldiers, they're not the victims. The people who they made the victims are the ones who rose up and overthrew them. But again, it's just an annoying argument. I see it on the right wing a lot. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you have any good examples of stuff I've mentioned? Whether that is examples the right wing like to talk about how communism killed all these people, or how many deaths capitalism causes every day, something like that. If you're on social media, follow me at The Cavernacle on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Check out my Reddit too, which is r/TheCavernacle for my subreddit, u/Tommy Cahill for my personal Reddit. Also check out my Patreon and WordPress in the description. Thanks to everyone who is a patron. I'm really, really grateful for that support. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.